financial support to the ANC during the liberation struggle. One could also argue that the United Kingdom is a crucial trading partner of South Africa's, and therefore there was a need to consolidate that relationship. But I would suggest that a far more compelling reason for the minister's determination to grant BAE South this contract was the £116 million of commissions, as the industry calls them, bribes, as you and I know them, that were paid on that one contract. And they were paid to Minister Joe Modise himself, to his sidekick, Feinstein, who a few years later became an official agent of BAE Systems, to the ANC itself, money which we used to fund our 1999 election campaign, and of course to the middlemen and agents who received £34 million in payments made through the British Virgin Islands. The only role that he played, according to a senior BAE executive who was involved with this particular contract, was to tell BAE that he could identify and have access to the key political decision makers on this particular transaction, and that he could assist BAE to financially, and I'm quoting, to financially incentivize these decision makers to come to the right decision. Feinstein was paid about £15 million, although he was political advisor to the defense minister of the time. Now, let's have a look for a moment at the role played by the British government in ensuring that BAE won this contract. Tony Blair made at least 2, possibly 4, visits to South Africa specifically and explicitly to argue that BAE should win this contract. He even went so far as to sign a memorandum of understanding with President Thabo Mbeki in Pretoria that committed BAE and the United Kingdom to the economic offsets that had been promised. Less than 25% of the economic activity has been generated. Less than 15% of the promised jobs have been created. But Tony Blair put his name to a memorandum of understanding committing the United Kingdom to 100% of both. In case his presence wasn't enough, the royal family, on what was then the Royal Yacht Britannia, made a special trip to Cape Town, where they moored at Cape Town Harbour and invited certain selected cabinet ministers who were key to the decision-making process to dinner on the royal yacht. South Africa's Minister of Trade and Industry, who was one of the great skeptics about the deal in cabinet, had his head turned on the deal after his dinner with the royal family. I think what is as important as the deal itself is the impact that it had on South Africa's young democracy. When my committee started to investigate the matter, which was presented to us by South Africa's Auditor General, I was told, first by the Minister in the Office of the President, at a meeting of the party's governance committee, where he said to me, "What the F do you think you are doing, questioning the integrity of the cabinet and the leadership of the ANC?" When I started to exhaustively go through the reasons for our concern, the meeting was ended. I was then called in to see the President himself, who told me we would deal with this matter internally within the party, not publicly in Parliament. I'd been involved in a previous matter which was dealt with internally in the party. The matter simply disappeared into the ether. I informed the President that it was our constitutional responsibility to pursue the matter. After 6 weeks, I was removed as head of the ANC component on the Public Accounts Committee. Any other members who had been seen as sympathetic to my point of view that the matter should be investigated were similarly removed. Our Chief Whip in Parliament, a man who had been chair of Parliament's Defence Committee at the time of the deal and had received a huge discount on a luxury 4x4 vehicle from one of the bidders for one of the contracts, and who very early on in the process had again told us that the matter should be dealt with privately, not publicly. Put in our place certain loyal whips. For the first time since 1994, the Public Accounts Committee, which had acted on a non-partisan basis, a non-voting basis, started to vote along party lines, where any involvement in this investigation was ended. We had, before I had been removed from the committee, set up a large multi-agency team to investigate the allegations of corruption. It was impossible for the ANC to simply rescind our resolution. So instead what they did is they excluded the country's main anti-corruption body at the time from the inquiry, mainly because the head of the body was not sympathetic to the ANC. Thabo Mbeki then unconstitutionally called in the heads of the 4 other investigative bodies and told them exactly who and what they could and could not investigate. So, for instance, a very controversial financier who was involved in channeling a whole lot of the money to its political home, about him, the investigators were told, not only don't you investigate him, you don't even mention the man's name. So the ANC and the government were prepared to undermine and destroy key institution of South Africa's democracy that so many of them had fought so hard to achieve in order to protect themselves and the political party. The institution of Parliament went from being an accountable, vibrant forum where the executive and the cabinet were held to account, as Mandela had told us when we went into office in 1994, was our constitutional responsibility to do, to becoming nothing more than a rubber stamp for the wishes of the ANC leadership. The Public Accounts Committee has never been able to investigate an allegation of corruption against a senior member of the ANC. The prosecutorial and investigative bodies were destroyed by this intervention. The main anti-corruption body, the Scorpions, ceased to exist at the beginning of this year. But as bad as the damage done to South Africa's democracy was that this loss of moral compass on the part of this remarkable liberation movement was the beginning of a series of corruption scandals in which they used pretty much the same modus operandi that they had used in this arms transaction to enrich senior members of the party and the party itself. At its last triennial congress in December of 2007, the Treasurer General of the ANC stood up This is a gentleman by the name of Mendi Missima, whose wife was the Minister of Health at the time, known as Dr. Beetroot, the woman who, together with Thabo Mbeki, claimed that HIV did not cause AIDS, and further claimed that beetroot, garlic, and the African potato could cure people of AIDS. And it is worth bearing in mind that while we were spending an amount of money that will ultimately amount to over £8 billion on arms and weapons we didn't need and barely use, Thabo Mbeki told the 5.5 million South Africans who were living with HIV and AIDS that we could not afford to provide the antiretroviral medication that they needed to stay alive through the public health system. At the most conservative possible estimate, 320,000 adult South Africans and 35,000 children below the age of 3 died as a consequence of Mbeki and his health minister's denialism, as a consequence of their desire to spend billions on BAE's jets rather than put them into the public health system. The corruption scandals that have hit South Africa subsequent to that have, as I've said, all been of a similar modus operandi, have profoundly and fundamentally undermined the rule of law in a country in which 50 people are murdered a day, in a country in which the Deputy President Kgalema Motlanthe, a close ally of Nelson Mandela's, has recently said corruption is so pervasive within both the ANC and all levels of government that we just don't know what to do, to quote him. 3 weeks ago, the South African government announced that it would be purchasing 47 billion rands worth of transport planes. 3 years ago, the same planes were quoted to the South African government at 19 billion. So it's gone from 19 to 47 billion. South Africa is about to embark on yet another arms deal. The question I ask is who will benefit this time? It won't be the people of South Africa. It probably won't even be the Defence Force that is procuring them. It will be the senior political elite in South Africa and the arms companies providing the planes. And finally, in my research for the book I'm working on at the moment on the global arms trade, BAE Systems constantly emerges as amongst the worst bribers and corruptors of any of the companies operating out there. And